Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a problem that sounds a bit abstract, but it's one of those things that genuinely keeps me up at night.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't mean like, did I leave the stove on kind of worry. I mean more like, is everything I think I know about how the world works actually based on a lie?
That is a very dramatic opening. I'm guessing we're not talking about a conspiracy theory.
No tinfoil hats today. We are talking about the central mystery of qualitative research.
Okay.
We live in a world that's just obsessed with data, right? If you run a survey, you know when you're done. You hit 1,000 respondents, you get your margin of error, plus or minus 3%, and you go home. It's simple.
Right. There's a clear finish line.
Exactly. But what if you're doing interviews? What if you're, I don't know, observing a workplace culture or digging into historical archives? How do you know when you were done?
It is the million-dollar question. In the qualitative world, which, that's where we get most of our deep insights about human behavior, leadership, culture, there isn't a stop button on the machine. You could, in theory, just interview people forever.
Forever. So for years, researchers have relied on this concept called saturation, which, to be honest, it sounds like a chemistry term to me.
It does. Or maybe what happens to a sponge when you drop it in a bucket of water.
Right. But in this context, saturation is supposed to be the gold standard. It's the moment where a researcher can confidently stand up and say, okay, I've heard everything I need to hear. Nothing new is emerging. I can stop.
Supposed to be is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence.
A lot. Because we are looking at a massive review paper by Moore, Aguinis, and Darden. They reviewed 429 sources to see how researchers are actually handling this idea. And honestly, it's a mess.
Mess might be putting it lightly. It's more like a crisis of credibility.
Let's hit the listener with the numbers, because when I read this, I actually laughed out loud. It was a nervous laugh.
I can imagine.
Out of hundreds of studies they reviewed, how many do you think actually gave concrete evidence, like real proof you could look at, that they'd reached saturation?
It is a shockingly low number.
It's basically none. Specifically, 76.3% of the studies claimed they reached saturation, but provided absolutely zero evidence to back it up.
Zero.
They just wrote, we reached saturation, and then moved on. It's like me telling the IRS, don't worry, I paid enough in taxes, without showing a single receipt.
And it gets even worse.
Yeah.
42% of the studies didn't even bother to define what they meant by the word saturation.
They just used it as a buzzword.
Exactly. It's the Wild West of methodology.
So our mission today is to, try and clean up this mess. We're going to unpack a new framework that Moore and his colleagues propose. It's a 3-step process: define, assess, and report. But before we get to the fix, I really want to push on why this matters, because I can hear a listener thinking, okay, so some academics are lazy with their paperwork. Who cares? How does this affect me?
It affects everything.
Yeah.
It all comes down to a concept called trustworthiness.
Okay.
See, in the quantitative world, the world of numbers, we talk about validity and reliability.
Sure.
But in the qualitative world, the world of stories and patterns, we're looking for credibility, confirmability, and transferability. And if you can't prove you reach saturation, your research lacks all of those.
So you're basically building a skyscraper on a foundation of what? Trust me, bro.
That's a perfect way to put it, yes.
And the source material gives a terrifying example of this. They call it the cascading effect. This is where it really hits the real world.
This is a classic House of Cards scenario.
Yeah.
The authors point to a seminal leadership study. Now, we won't name names, but this study has been cited over 2,600 times as of 2026.
2,600 times. That means it's in textbooks, it's in business school curriculums. Managers are probably being trained on this right now.
Oh, absolutely. And the original study never mentioned saturation, not once. They didn't define it, didn't assess it. They just stopped when they felt like stopping.
Okay, but that was probably decades ago. Surely the people who followed up on it, they fixed that. I mean, science is self-correcting, right?
You would hope so.
Yeah.
But the review looked at 2 subsequent studies that built directly on that shaky foundation. One with 27 surveys, another with 42 interviews. They also failed to address saturation. So what you have is potentially decades of leadership theory built on an incomplete picture.
Wow.
We assume these theories are solid, but we don't actually know if the original researchers just missed something critical because they got tired of doing interviews.
That is the legacy of error they talk about. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about management is actually just a false positive.
Right. And the authors use a matrix to explain this, which is very similar to type I and type 2 errors in statistics.
Let's break that down, because I think this is where the real cost of bad research becomes clear. What's the danger of a false positive here?
A false positive, in this context, is stopping too early. You think you're done, you think you've found the pattern, but you haven't. You miss the nuance. You miss the black swan.
The paper cites a great example of this from Fielding and Fielding from back in 2000. This was a reanalysis of old data, wasn't it?
Yes, Fielding and Fielding went back and looked at data from a classic study on crime and deviance. The original researchers had packed up, gone home, thinking they had the full story.
Okay.
But when Fielding and Fielding looked at that same data with fresh eyes, and they spent more time with it, they found an entirely new theme that the original researchers had completely missed.
So the first team said, we know why these criminals behave this way, but they were actually missing a huge piece of the puzzle because they quit too soon.
Exactly. And imagine if policy decisions were being made based on that original, incomplete study. You might be funding the wrong interventions. You might be trying to solve a problem you don't even fully understand.
That's the danger of the false positive. So what's on the other side? The false negative.
This is stopping too late. This is the efficiency killer. This is where you just keep collecting data long after you've learned anything new. The review mentions one study where the researchers conducted 165 interviews.
165. That sounds exhausting.
It's massive.
Oh, okay.
And it gets crazier. They also analyzed 150 pages of case data per company for 5 different companies.
Oh.
The authors of our review suggest this was likely way, way more than they needed.
So they were just burning cash at that point.
Burning cash, burning time, burning the goodwill of their participants. You know, if you're a CEO paying a consultant for a culture audit and they interviewed 200 people when they could have gotten the answer in 30, you've just wasted a fortune. That's why saturation matters. It tells you when to stop wasting resources.
Okay, so we've got researchers stopping too early and missing the truth, or stopping too late and wasting money. It's just chaos. So let's fix it. This brings us to step 1 of the framework. Define your terms.
This seems so basic, but it's where 42% of the studies fail. The problem is that saturation isn't just one thing. There are actually 4 distinct ways to conceptualize it, and you have to pick one before you even start.
Right. I think this is a common misconception. I always just thought saturation meant, I'm not hearing anything new. But the authors say that's way too simplistic.
No new info can mean very different things depending on what you're looking for. The first type is theoretical saturation.
Okay.
This comes from grounded theory, specifically Glaser and Strauss back in 1967.
The heavy hitters.
The legends, yeah. In theoretical saturation, you're not just looking for repeated words. You're building a theory, a model of how something works. You stop collecting data when no new theoretical insights emerge.
So it's about the theory itself, not just the data.
Exactly. It's about the robustness of your model.
Okay, so that's for the theory builders. What's type 2?
Number 2 is inductive thematic saturation. This is perfect for exploratory work. Let's say you're studying something brand new, like how people use AI for dating. You don't have a theory yet. You just want to see what themes pop up. You stop when no new codes or themes are appearing in your analysis.
Got it. So type 1 is about the theory, type 2 is about the themes.
Right.
What's type 3?
Type 3 is a priori thematic saturation. A priori means from the before. This is where you walk in with a checklist.
Give me a real-world example of that one.
Sure. Imagine you're a safety inspector in a hospital. You have a very specific protocol. Hands washed, masks on, equipment sterilized. You're observing staff to see if they follow it. Your categories are predefined.
Oh, okay.
You stop collecting data when you've confirmed or filled those pre-existing boxes. You're not looking for new discoveries. You're looking for confirmation of a known framework.
That makes a lot of sense. You're not trying to discover a new emotion. You're just checking if the safety rails are up. So finally, type 4.
Data saturation. This is the really pragmatic approach. It's about pure redundancy. You stop when the data becomes repetitive. You've simply heard it all. This is often used in really large-scale studies where you just need to ensure you've covered all the bases.
So a researcher can't just say, I reached saturation. They have to say, I reached inductive thematic saturation, or I reached theoretical saturation.
Precisely. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the choice you make actually depends on your philosophical lens.
Oh boy, philosophy. The authors talk about post-positivists versus interpretivists, and I feel like we need to translate this into plain English because otherwise listeners are going to tune out.
Fair point. Okay, let's use an analogy. Think of a post-positivist like a land surveyor, a map maker.
Okay, a map maker. I'm with you.
A map maker believes there is an objective reality out there. The mountain is exactly 3,000 feet high. The river bends to the left. Their job is just to measure it accurately.
Right.
If you're a post-positivist researcher, You believe there is a truth to be found. So you might use a priori saturation because you're testing that reality against a known standard.
Got it. And the interpretivist?
An interpretivist is more like a film critic or biographer.
A film critic. I like that.
Yeah. They don't believe there is one single truth about the movie. The truth depends on who's watching it, their background, their feelings. Reality is socially constructed.
Okay.
So if you're an interpretivist, you would lean toward theoretical saturation because you're co-creating that understanding with the people you interview. You aren't measuring a mountain, you're interpreting a story.
That is actually really, really helpful. So
Yeah.
if I'm the map maker, I have a checklist. If I'm the film critic, I'm looking for the deeper meaning.
Exactly. And you have to know which one you are before you start, or your entire research project will be confused.
So, step 1. Know thyself and define your saturation. But once you've done that, you actually have to measure it. Which brings us to step 2, assessing saturation. And this is where the paper says we really need to stop guessing.
Right. Most people just guess. They say, I'll do 20 interviews, and they do 20 interviews and they stop. That's not assessment. That's just a quota.
So what's the alternative? The paper suggests an iterative approach, the initial sample size strategy.
It's much smarter. You set an initial batch, say 8 interviews. You analyze those completely. Then you assess, is there new stuff coming up? Yes. Okay, let's add a batch of 4, analyze again. You keep going in these cycles until the new info just dries up. It's dynamic.
But I want to talk about the geeky cool example they gave, Tran et al., from 2017, because they didn't just iterate, they did math.
This is one of my favorite examples in the whole review. So Tran and his colleagues were studying water insecurity.
Which is a heavy topic. We're talking about people literally struggling to access clean water.
Extremely heavy, high stakes, lots of emotion in those interviews. But Tran's team decided to apply this really rigorous mathematical model. They calculated the slope of theme accumulation.
Whoa, the slope of theme accumulation. Break that down for me.
Okay, imagine a graph. On the bottom axis, you have the number of interviews. On the side axis, you have the number of new themes you find. Things like rationing water, borrowing from neighbors, health fears.
Okay, visualizing it.
In the first few interviews, that line shoots straight up. Every person you talk to gives you like 5 new themes. But as you go on, the curve starts to flatten out. The 10th interview gives you 2 new themes. The 15th gives you maybe 1.
And eventually it just flatlines.
Right, Tran et al. Essentially calculated the cost of the next interview. If doing one more interview, which takes time, money, and emotional labor, only gives you 0.5% more insight, is it worth it? They used calculus to prove they were done.
That is fascinating. It's taking something that feels so subjective, human stories, and putting a hard metric on it. The cost of the next story is too high for the value it provides.
It sounds cold, but it's actually incredibly responsible research. It respects everyone's resources and ensures the data is solid.
Now, not everyone can do calculus. Most researchers are just coding transcripts. But the authors make a really crucial distinction here between code saturation and meaning saturation.
Yes.
And I feel like this is where a lot of businesses get it wrong.
This is the trap. Code saturation is when you have all the labels. You've heard the words burnout, stress, quiet quitting 100 times. You have the codes, and that usually happens pretty fast. Some studies say you have all the buzzwords within 9 interviews.
But having the label isn't the same as knowing what it means. I mean, I know the words quantum physics, but don't ask me to explain it.
Exactly. That is meaning saturation. You might have the code burnout, but do you understand the nuances? Do you understand how burnout feels different for a single parent versus a recent college grad? Do you understand the mechanism behind it, meaning saturation takes much longer to achieve?
And this is the business application, right? If a CEO stops at code saturation, they get a report that says, your employees are dealing with burnout. So they buy everyone a meditation app and call it a day.
Right. They address the word, not the meaning. If they had waited for meaning saturation, they might have learned the burnout was caused by a specific broken process in the accounting software, not a lack of meditation. Stopping at code saturation leads to shallow solutions.
So don't stop when you have the words. Stop when you have the understanding. The authors also suggest some credibility checks to prove you've reached that point. Things like negative case analysis.
Which is essentially the hunt for the weirdo.
I love that, the hunt for the weirdo.
In a good way. You actively look for the one data point that doesn't fit your theory. If your theory is everyone loves the new remote work policy, you go find the one person who hates it.
Okay.
If you could explain why they hate it within your framework, maybe they lack a home office, then your theory is robust. If you just ignore them, your theory is weak.
So you've defined it in step 1. You've assessed it in step 2, using math or iteration. Now step 3, reporting. Show your work.
This is where that 76.3% of studies failed. They just said, we reached saturation. And that is not enough. The authors want total transparency. They want to see things like saturation grids.
Describe a saturation grid for me. What does that look like?
It's a visual tool. Imagine a spreadsheet. The rows are all your themes, and the columns are your interviews, 1 through 30. You just put an X in the box every time a theme appears. You can look at that grid and visually see that from interview 25 to 30, the grid is basically empty of new X's. You can point to it and say, look, we stopped because the data stopped coming.
That is undeniable proof.
It is. But my favorite example of reporting, the gold star student in this review, is a study by priori from 2023.
Yes, the veterinary study. This one really stuck with me because it felt so human.
It is a beautiful study. Priori was looking at the emotions involved in being a vet. It's such a paradoxical job. You have to care deeply for animals, but you also have to run a business and charge money for saving lives, sometimes to people who can't afford it.
The caring versus commerce conflict.
Exactly. Now, the reason priori is the hero of this story isn't that she made some fancy graph. It's that she showed the journey. She collected data over 10 years, from 2009 to 2019.
10 years. Most corporate studies last 10 days.
I know. She started with one idea about discrete emotions, like anger, sadness. But as she analyzed the data, she realized that wasn't capturing the full picture.
So she didn't just jam the data into her boxes.
No. She paused. She went back. She shifted her focus to social emotions. She collected more data based on that new understanding.
She let the data change her mind.
She did. And she used triangulation combining interviews, observations, and archives. She even went back to the vets in 2019, 10 years later, and did member checking, asking them, does this model I built reflect your life? And they said yes.
So she didn't have a saturation grid necessarily, but she described the process so clearly that you couldn't help but trust her findings.
That is the ultimate goal. She proved her trustworthiness through action. She didn't just use the buzzword saturation to get published. She lived the methodology.
And that's the standard we should all be aiming for. Whether you're an academic or a user researcher at a tech company or a policymaker, don't just check the box. Do the work.
Precisely. Because bad data leads to bad decisions.
So let's wrap this all up. We've unpacked this Moore, Aquinas, and Darden framework. If you're listening to this and you ever have to commission research or even just read a study, here is what you need to look for.
It really comes down to those 3 steps. Define. Did they tell you what kind of saturation they were looking for, or did they just use the magic word? Assess. Did they just guess a number, or do they have strategy? Did they look for the weirdos? Did they stop at the buzzwords, or did they get to the real meaning?
Right.
And finally, report. Did they show you the evidence? Can you see the grid? Can you trace their journey?
It's about moving qualitative research from just storytelling to actual science.
And it's about legacy. We started this whole deep dive talking about the legacy of error.
That haunting idea that we might be standing on a foundation of sand.
Just think about the management theories you use every day. The facts about leadership or consumer behavior that you take for granted, how many of them are actually false positives? How many brilliant-sounding ideas looked good just because the researchers stopped asking questions the moment they heard what they wanted to hear?
It makes you want to go check the footnotes on your favorite business book, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Always check the methodology. Skepticism is a superpower.
On that note, thanks for listening to this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking for the black swans, and maybe, just maybe, know when to stop.
See you next time.